Good morning.
Good morning,
Friends. We were dealing with Block 2, Understanding Learners' Development in Diversity in the elective Educational Psychology. We were discussing about the special needs of children and how the special needs have to be addressed by the institutions, as well as how some special provisions have to be given to children with special needs, like people with physical handicaps, as well as children with visual impairment, and also children with what we call hearing impairment, as well as speech problems. And today we'll be dealing with inclusive education. Initially, we discussed something like what is inclusive education? Why is inclusive education required? And it is not the inclusive education exclusively deals with what we call the children with special needs. The education of children with special education with special needs is also a part of the inclusive education, but there are many other categories of children who are excluded from the inclusive education as such. Now here, if we consider that the concepts of universalization of education or providing education to all the children who rightfully would require education is not seen much of the time. That is, all children are not provided with educational opportunities. The reasons may be many. We find that education should be given to all children. So it is a state policy as such. But when we come to the actual realities, we see many children staying out of the educational system or the school system. So the idea of providing equal opportunities of education of children of a particular age group, so that it helps in the development of the society as well as nation, is the thought behind the many educational reforms. We know that education is a powerful instrument of social change. That is, any social change or development of society is dependent on the education of the children. And that means many people who would not have a chance economically to grow would actually find a leverage, or they will find something of use when they are able to gain education and make a better prospects. They have better prospects in education as well as in employment. So this is a sort of social shift, or we call it as an upward movement. Therefore, in spite of many efforts by the nation and by many planning commissions, we find that the education is not reached out to all. There are certain marginalized sections in society who do not get the benefits of education. Now, inclusive education would mean that all the children should be covered, and the government or the state or the school should have certain approaches or strategies or structures in which they can try to involve. They can try to involve all the children with an appropriate age range and see it is the responsibility of the regular system to educate all children. That's why we have got the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, where government has made appropriate, it has taken appropriate measures to see that all the children get educated. Now, if we see the broad spectrum of both formal learning, that is a regular school system, as well as informal systems, should try to help proper guidance and also proper support to the students who are in the requirement of education. Now, we know that all the children are not of the same, they're not from the same type of socio-economic background, so they do not have much access to all the resources, nor to the schooling systems. Now, the teachers and the learners should actually see that most of the whatever learners they come to the schools, they are given the provision of education, and the teachers should also see that providing all the children with education as a challenge to them. That is, we know that when a teacher enters a classroom, he finds the students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Now, this would also cause differences in the type of teaching or learning activities that take place in the classroom. So the teacher, instead of thinking it as a challenge, she should, instead of thinking it as a problem, should try to see it as a challenge and try to overcome the differences that exist in the learning and provide such a setting in the classroom, or he or she should use certain appropriate measures by which all the children's potential to learn would be enhanced. Now we see that the equal participation of all the children in education would mean that although the persons with disabilities, that is physical, social, or emotional, or mental, what we call deprivation, are seen, still they should be what we call motivated, and they should be taken part, they should take part in the process of education in the classroom. So here, we should try to see that these people may not be excluded, but they should be included in the general education settings or in the general classrooms. Now, this means the individual may have a personal choice to go for a special school if needed, but the general educational setting also should not try to what we call exclude the moderately mild children with having certain physical disabilities or certain emotional problems, but try to integrate into the system, because the benefits of integrating a disabled child into the system are also there. So depends on the mild or moderate conditions, one can try to adjust these children in the regular classroom, but the provision to get themselves educated if the need arises or if the condition warrants, that is if the child feels or the parent feels that the child needs special education and the school setting is not doing justice, maybe they have the option to go for a school with a special needs. But generally, the general education should also try to what we call involve these children in this, or try to integrate these children to the regular system and provide the provision of education so that all the children will learn to live with diversity and help each other. So this is the concept of the inclusive education. So inclusive education means one should welcome diverse sort of children into the classroom, because we know that every individual is different. And also it should benefit all the learners, not only a few. And we should say that access to education is given to all. Of course, this means that the reforms of education should be there. And we also should try to improve the quality of education and see that the special schools are there, but at the same time, additional support to children is also given in the regular educational system. That is, we should try to meet the needs of the children with the disabilities also, and also with children who are excluded, as well as the normal average children. That is, children may come from different social settings and economic settings, but a provision to educate them would help them to become more humane and also interact with each other. So the social benefits of learning would be more. Now, that does not mean one children should be given more exposure or he should be given priority over the others. It means trying to develop the others in synchrony, that is, along with each other. Now, if we were to see the background of the inclusive education, yesterday we were talking about the World Conference on Special Needs Education Access and Quality at Salamanca in Spain. And they have given a statement there, that is, the representatives meet there to discuss on the aspects of education, on special education especially, and they have given a statement saying that everybody should be included, that education should be inclusive. And at Dakar in 2000, which is Dakar is a place in Senegal, where the educations have met and they have again emphasized on the what we call the inclusive education. So the United Nations also has adopted the standard rules on equalization of opportunities for persons with disabilities. It has given a set form of rules for all the education institutions or the governments, so that the persons with disabilities are also provided with certain opportunities all throughout their life. And here they said the inclusive education is something which should reduce barriers to all the children and also in the environment. And it should mean that the age appropriately, all the children should be incorporated in the local schools, and all the education should be tailored in such a way that the needs of these children who are lacking in some aspects, that is with physical, they may be suffering from physical or emotional or mental problems, they should also be tried to be integrated in the normal classroom. This is known as an inclusive education. Similarly, we have the Unesco Convention Against Discrimination on Education in 1960, which also said that the children with special needs or any child should not be discriminated against, but rather he or she should be integrated into the regular school system. Now, in 1994, the Salamanca Statement, which was actually signed by 92 countries, and also recently in 2094, it was actually done. And the 25th year was also celebrated. And here, all the children with special needs, it is not only should be focused upon, but also the children who come from the marginalized sections also should be marginalized, in the sense they do not have access to education. They should also be provided education. Now, all children should learn together, and wherever possible, regardless of any difficulties or differences, they have to have education. Now, the individual schools should try to recognize that the inclusive education is a part, and it is necessary to understand the diverse needs of the children. All children do not have the same needs, but every child needs to be developed to the best maximum possible extent. And this means that education should be given at all school levels. Now, what is the need for inclusive education? In India, if you were to consider, we find many millions of children are in the labor market. Also, we find that they do not have access to education, and most of the children suffer from hunger and poverty. Many children drop out of the school so as to support their own families or to support themselves. Also, we see in the streets, many children braving hunger, poverty, and also violence. Now, childhood does not mean it is a happy phase for all. Childhood may also mean trouble to certain students. So here they may have endless struggle sometimes, and they also have dreams, but these dreams are not fulfilled. Many NGOs, of course, take action, they take action. They provide them with some education too, but the numbers who are outside the school are more than what can a state or NGOs can cater to. This means the policies of health, nutrition, and holistic development should be integrated with those of the education. Now, what does the concept of education mean as such? The key elements are, one is, it is a process. It does not mean it's just a one day aspect or one day activity, but rather than we should always try to better the way in which the children will be integrated into the schools, and all the diverse students should be tried to be all the needs of the diverse students should be met in the classroom. The second thing is, inclusion means that the removal of barriers should be there. For example, in a school, providing a ramp is necessary, because even disabled children who are physically disabled may be able to walk into the schools, may be able to come into the school. Also, we should try to see how the children are faring in a classroom and collect the information, feedback from them, and also try to meet the needs of the children. So one aspect is trying to make it as a process, a regular process on a everyday basis, where we try to integrate the children into of different backgrounds into the system. And the second is trying to remove the barriers. Sometimes they may be cultural barriers or social barriers. For example, consider a child who comes from a socially weak or economically backward section of a society. Now, they are not able to get proper educational resources. So that means sharing of resources is required at such a place. For example, they may not be having access to certain books. In such a case, sharing of resources is required. So here, what we say is the removal of barriers or certain barriers which come as a background, they should be taken care of. Also, inclusion is about the presence, participation, and achievement of all the children. This means the student should be able to attend the class, that is the presence. The participation is children from different backgrounds should have the teaching, learning experiences, and they should be able to participate in the classroom. And the third thing is the achievement, what they get and how they think about it, what is their feedback, and what is the view of learners themselves about their achievements. All this also matters. Now, inclusion means this is no learner should be marginalized, but they should be integrated into the classroom, and underachievers or overachievers may be seen sometimes, but generally achievement should be the purpose of the teacher in the classroom, so that all the learners will be able to exhibit certain achievement and also develop to the maximum of their potential. Now we see the disadvantaged and deprived children in the society. Mostly these are the children who with a low level of education and coming from the one parent families. Sometimes we find that there is low income in families, and this low income also makes them what we call distant from the education field. We find that there is a low professional status of the family members. If they come from the weaker socio-economic families, we find that the parents also are not educated most of the time. Sometimes they may be unemployed parents or persons who are coming from low strata of the society, or people who may be from the minority origins who have not fared well in society. And most of these people do not have access to education. And as a process, their children too would not be able to get good education. Now, the goals of inclusive education is, if we try to see, we try to actually accommodate as many children as possible from the diverse backgrounds. Now, when we consider gender equality is a concept where men and women, that is the child, female child along the male child, are given the equal importance in a classroom. And because we see, because of gender differences, there are certain problems faced by the female in the society. For example, there may be gender-based violences, child marriages, or early, because of child marriage, as a consequence, they may have early pregnancies. And sometimes the women are burdened with the household work, so they have problems. So most of the women dropouts are seen. Now, the policy should be promoted in such a way that the health, justice, governance, and freedom from child labor are all incorporated in one. Their girl child is provided with education along with certain incentives like having good food or safety, security, etc. Now, if we are to see the principles of inclusive education, the girl child should also be provided with education, both primary, secondary, and higher level of education. And the inclusive education sees that most of the people from the diverse backgrounds are provided education, and the children with different learning styles and achievements are all equally valued. Learners should be able to fulfill their inner potential. They should be able to develop their own learning requirements in the classroom, and support should be given. And we should also try to develop friendship between the children who are marginalized with the more affluent children, and see that the camaraderie develops. And here the benefits of such a system is the children become more, they try to be more understanding. They try to develop appreciation and accept individual differences. They are able to understand the concept of diversity, and it prepares them for their life as adults. Now, this also results in greater academic outcomes and developing the humaneness, and all the students are able to share the resources. But in spite of whatever we think about the inclusive education, and the UNESCO's article talks about the biggest hurdles in the what we call the inclusive education. One is the attitude of the parents, society, as well as the teachers, because our attitudes are there from the life from many years. Our attitudes die hard, and we find that accommodating all the children of the different diverse types, that is children with disabilities or learning difficulties, to be accommodated in regular classroom, it is looked down upon. Also, we find that the physical barriers are there. As I was saying, ramps have to be provided in the educational institution, but not all schools have the ramps. So here, the poorly cared for buildings or dilapidated buildings, they can actually hamper the children even from entering the schoolroom. The teachers are also overburdened, and they're not able to take the additional work which comes when actually they have to take care of the diverse learners. Sometimes the language and communication, for example, consider a child coming from the lower socio-economic background. The language with which he speaks, the culture from which he hails from, makes it difficult for him to understand what is happening in the classroom. So he comes to a new and unfamiliar situation. In such a case, the students also face discrimination, and they tend to have low expectations about themselves. So we have to see that the language or communication is made easier for them. They are taught, their experiences are made rich, the learning teaching situations are provided in such a way that they are accommodative of their needs too. And if we consider the socio-economic factors, the children who are hailing from traditionally poor families or from families who have no employment or more unemployment, they do not have the basic necessities. So they may face violence or poor health services and other social factors which may also hamper their education. Also, many of these activities of inclusive education would mean that more funding is required. So the UNESCO talks about the necessity for funding all these and to have an understanding organization of the school system. Because if the organizational or managemental systems are not appreciative of the inclusive educational practices as well as the teacher's role in it, and if the teachers, if they wish to develop certain good practices too, when there is no organizational support, the teachers are not able to do enough justice. Now, sometimes the educational system may have certain problems, that is, the policies may themselves be against the inclusive education. So policy makers have to understand the concept of the inclusive education and see that the overall efforts are there in the school system, and they have to provide certain policies in the mainstream educational systems so that the all enjoy the benefits of the education. Now, this inclusive education does not mean that quality education is not given. We know sometimes in a classroom, there are overachievers or people who achieve more than the average person. So when we try to practice inclusivist education, or when we try to what we call curtail our educational teaching or try to come down to the level of the lower socio-economic strata, sometimes the students who are intelligent may find it somewhat boring. So it is really a challenge to the teacher to actually develop certain type of educational experiences in the classroom where the needs of all the children are met. This is not a Herculean task, not a difficult task, but at the same time, it would require the teacher's resourcefulness so that the highly individualized set are given in different timings, or also given additional work, or they are taught, the highly intelligent child is able to teach the lesser intelligent child. Now, because this is necessary, because we know that in an educational setting, the self-esteem and positive conception of oneself, if we say you are good enough, you're strong enough, and in such an environment, the real participation and fellowship would develop, and it will be actively experienced, and therefore the children become more cooperative and socially understanding. So there must be chances for individualized learning, and no pupil should be obliged to stand outside the fellowship or participation in the classroom. So accessible and flexibility in the curricula is required. Along in the classroom, that is within the framework of the classroom, individual adaptation should be made. Also, the school system should be reformed so that it becomes more inclusive. That is, the existing attitudes, values, and lack of understanding, lack of skills, and limited resources should be addressed. And we should see there's a clarity of purpose, there are realistic goals, there's enough motivation and support, and the resources should be shared, and there should be proper evaluation and feedback of what is happening in a classroom. The benefits of such inclusive education are, now it benefits all the children, and the policies and practices become more humanistic. The children's participation is enhanced. They become better humans. We try to reduce the discrimination in the society. And also there is a renewed strengthening of partnerships. And we see that the educational system as such is strengthened. Now, this would require a flexible time framework, greater freedom for teachers, and additional assistance in the classroom is to be provided. More time should be given for teachers, and special support should be given both policy-wise and resources-wise. Now, this would mean, try to ask yourself whether all the values that promote inclusion are being practiced in any school, whether the human rights are a part of the child's curriculum. Does the curriculum provide any scope for coexistence among the children? Is the curriculum relevant to the children's real lives? Are they providing enough environmental education? Is the education is being child-centered? Is the curriculum suitable for the national assessment system? Is the feedback what we are getting is helping to revise our lessons or revise our curriculum? If it is not so, that means the educational system is not able to actually help the school, all the children, and it is not being inclusive. So we have to change our system in such a way that the inclusive sort of education where all children needs are met and individualized with the general classroom is done. This, of course, is a problematic thing because when the teachers try to finish the syllabus or try to maintain certain quality standards as being determined by the administrative system, now sometimes it is difficult to meet the needs of the individual learners, but it is the challenge here that the teacher has to use his resources as well as the classroom resources and convince the management, and within the time framework given, he should be more accommodative to all the learner needs. So this is the concept of inclusive education. Now, we'll be going to the next chapter, that is block 3 on learning and memory. Here, we'll be talking about learning. As we know, learning is a continuous process in the human life. In the human span of development, learning occurs in many phases. We talk about lifelong learning. That is, we learn throughout our lives. We learn different things, and we also try to improve our behavior or attitudes or language or our beliefs all throughout our life. Our personality goes on developing along with our learning. And learning influences the way we think. The learning influences the way we act. The learning influences the way we feel. And therefore, we learn throughout our lives. Now, educational psychologists talk about how we learn actually, because sometimes we perceive things, sometimes we understand things, sometimes we make sense of what we have understood. So here, what actually is knowledge? A process, or is it a product? That is the essential thing. Knowledge is a process, means when we make different activities, we get involved. At the end of the day, whatever experiences we get, that is known as the product. So knowledge is considered both a process, that is the way with which we observe and get the knowledge, as well as a product. Now, Benjamin Samuel Bloom is an American educational psychologist. He was there from 1913 to 1999. He has influenced the field of educational psychology. Here, he talks about the different objectives of education, and he has classified the objectives of education. If we were to actually understand what are the objectives of education, suppose we were to teach the children in a classroom. At the end of the classroom, the child is supposed to gain certain knowledge. And if the teacher enters a classroom with the idea of actually trying to get some learning outcomes from children, that is at the end of the lesson, what he wishes the children to actually gain from what he has taught, then he has to go with a set of ideas or with a plan on what he wants the children to achieve at the end of the lesson. Now that is known as the learning objectives. The aims of education may be bigger, but they cover the whole aspect of the curriculum. For example, we can say, my aim of teaching a classroom is to make them as better individuals or better citizens. But it's a whole gamut of things, or where many things may be addressed. But when I enter a classroom, I would like to make the children learn about the structure of a plant or know about the concept of democracy, then that is limited to learning objectives. So objectives are time-bound, they are also limited, and they try to actually address certain learning outcomes in the child. Now, Benjamin Bloom tried to actually understand what we try to evaluate. At the end of the lesson, what we are trying to evaluate. And if a teacher were to know what he would try to evaluate in the children at the end of the lesson, he would teach in such a manner so that the concepts of what he would evaluate would be incorporated in the lesson. That is, we do not test what we do not teach. So what we teach is according to what we want the children to make certain differences in their behavior. Here we talk about the learning behavior. So the children in a classroom exhibit certain learning behaviors, and at the end of the lesson, after instruction from the teacher, the children may come out with certain learning outcomes, and it is these learning outcomes that we try to examine or we try to evaluate. Now, these concepts with which we are trying to enter a classroom, or with which the ideas with which we want to develop in the children, these are known as the learning objectives. Now, Bloom has classified the learning objectives, and he says these are very important from the what we call from the concept of educational from the teaching. And he has said that there are several types of objectives, learning objectives. There may be some higher forms of thinking, there may be some lower forms of thinking. For example, trying to remember something, trying to understand something come from the lower forms of learning. Whereas trying to analyze, trying to evaluate, now these are the higher forms of learning. So the rote memorization or trying to learn something by heart comes under the lower forms of learning. Trying to interpret, trying to synthesize, trying to analyze, trying to interpolate, trying to predict, now these come under the higher forms of learning. Now, let us see what are the different domains of learning that Bloom was talking about. Bloom's taxonomy is a hierarchical model. That is, there's a stepwise process in which he tries to classify the learning objectives from simple to complex. Now, there are various levels of learning. Now, if we are to identify and measure learning, we have to understand them in the terms of learning objectives. What are the three different domains that Benjamin Bloom talks about? He talks one about the cognitive domain, which comes under the field of knowledge, how we actually perceive knowledge, how we gain knowledge, how we understand things, how we learn to know things. That comes under the what domain of cognitive domain. There is also affective domain. What feelings we possess, what emotions we exhibit, what sort of attitudes we develop, what values we try to have in our lives, all these come under the affective domain. Affective, as we know, deals with feelings. Then last one is the psychomotor domain. Psychomotor domain talks about the psychomotor aspects, how we actually are able to perform certain activities, develop certain skills. For example, movement, that is, for example, consider a sport activity, or consider a dance, or consider drawing something. Now, all these come under the psychomotor domain, where both the intention to draw something as well as the motor activity, they together give rise to a particular skill or adeptness in a particular activity. Now, if we are to consider the cognitive behavior, now the simple activities, the cognitive domain outcomes can be actually classified under 5 or 6. One is recall, the ability to recall something from the previous lesson or previous experience. For example, if a teacher were to ask, do you remember or do you recall the earlier lesson? The student tries to recall what was told in the earlier class. So now this is a process of trying to memorizing or remembering. Also, comprehension is the ability to show a basic understanding. This is the next level. When you try to understand it, this is not the rote memory, but you try to use your intellectual, what we call concentration, intellectual ability to actually understand what's happening. So comprehension is the ability to show or to have an understanding about a subject. Application. If we learn something and understand something, but we try to apply that knowledge, whatever we gain, to a new situation or to a new process, that is known as understanding. The next would be, after application, would be analysis. That is, if the information is to be broken out logically, that would be called as analysis. Synthesis is the ability to actually create something new or trying to synthesize what we have learned into a component or consolidated form where all the individual events would be brought out into one large thing. Evaluation is the ability to evaluate the usefulness or the not usefulness of something, or how purposeful a thing is for our use. So the affective domain talks about, as I said earlier, with feelings, values, appreciations, enthusiasm, motivation, attitude, etc. Now, this is very difficult to measure these things in a child. For example, all these outcomes are very difficult to articulate to, and also very difficult to assess. For example, is it easy to assess here the child's attitude in a classroom? It would take more time, obviously. And is it easy to incorporate a value in the children? For example, if the child were to be taught about something like Swachh Bharat or about environmental education, now that would mean the values, suitable values have to be developed. So here he talks about certain processes by which this occurs. Initially, the child actually gains or receives information from the teacher. And this is called as receiving. After receiving, the child tries to respond to the information it is receiving. This is known as responding. Later, after some time, the child tries to value about what the teacher has said, known as valuing. And all these values will be organized in the child's brain according to the importance. There may be lesser values and there may be higher values. This is known as organization of values. That is, which value matters more. Later, after organizing the values, the child may integrate the value into its own value system. That is, the character is formed of the child is formed, and the value is incorporated into the child's life. And this is known as the character. That is, the value, it becomes imbibed in the child. That is, the child's character is now fully resplendent. The child is able to absorb the value. The child practices the value and is able to announce about the value, as well as it is able to practice the value fully, and it becomes the character of the child. Now, how we actually can see that we can actually try to elaborate on this. Now, if the students are aware of an attitude and the child's life also changes as a result of exposure to an attitude, and the child displays such values in their livelihood and also in its behavior, and it is a naturalized value that it becomes a part of it. And if it is not followed, for example, if somebody would dirty a place, the child who had learned the environmental education would feel it somewhat discomforting to be in such a situation. That means the child has incorporated or integrated the value of environmental education in its own life. So it becomes a part of its character. So this is how, that is, by the process of receiving, responding, valuing, organizing, character is formed in the child, that it comes under the affective domain. This is how the values or attitudes are formed. We know that values and attitudes are not easily formed. It is a long process. So all these are come under the affective domain. So mere knowledge, if it doesn't actually been turned into or shifted into a practice, it becomes most useless. So the emotional or the affective domain is also important. So along with knowledge, values or practices are also needed, and that is how affective domain has a significant part. Now we would come to the psychomotor domain. The psychomotor domain means the physical tasks or activities a child does in everyday day-to-day life. This means whatever the students get the knowledge, it is translated into activities. Now, skill learning or learning any vocations is done through the psychomotor domain. Now, it is not enough if one does an activity. They have to do it to the best of the activity. There is an example. A child is asked to run. He runs. At the end of the day, the teacher would ask, you have not run well. The child would say, I was not told how fast to run. I was just asked to run. Similarly, it is necessary that the child should be told with how much fast he has to run, or within how much time he should run. This would mean trying to setting standards of excellence. So if any skill has to be mastered, even the standards have to be set by the teacher. This is known as the criteria by which they are measured. For example, if a sportsman were there, suppose cricket, a cricket sportsman would require, he has to have a particular standard of batting or bowling. Similarly, there would be a particular standard for a singer or for a dancer. This would mean that their performance is evaluated against certain criteria along with the others' performance also. So these students should apply these skills or to their real life situations, and they should also be able to instruct or train others. So skills have certain criteria, certain ways of what we call training others. So all the psychomotor domain would mean learning skills using their psychomotor abilities. Also they should be able to master a skill, and they have certain standards or criteria by which their skills are measured. So we talked about the 3 domains of knowledge. There are 3 domains of knowledge, one pertaining to the understanding, one pertaining to the development of attitudes and values and other things, motivation, etc. And we have another domain which is dealing exclusively with the physical aspect. So this is known as knowing, and as well as knowing, as well as doing. Doing deals with psychomotor, and as well as feeling. So these are the 3 domains of knowledge. One is knowing, that is cognitive domain. Second is psychomotor domain with doing, as well as affective domain, that is feeling. Now, the revised Bloom's taxonomy was done in 2001 by what we call Anderson and Krathwohl. They have actually simplified the Bloom's taxonomy, and they said they have given adjectives for this, what we call the different cognitive outcomes. For example, if Bloom talked about the recall, they have called it as remember. And if Bloom talked about comprehension, they have given it as understanding. And Bloom talked about application, they said apply. And they also have given words like analyze, evaluate, and create. So we know that remembering is memory-based, understanding is comprehension-based, and application is what we call trying to focus an idea or trying to apply abstract idea into a concrete situation, or trying to solve a problem, a real-time problem, with whatever knowledge we have got from our prior experience. Analyzing is breaking down a concept or idea into small parts so that we are able to understand the relationship between the different parts. And also evaluating is trying to make the judgments about the value of an idea or on materials or criteria so that we'll be able to have an overall opinion. For example, if we have learned or mastered something, and if somebody were to ask you, what is your evaluation or feedback on this, we are able to say the merits and demerits of a particular system. Now that means we are able to judge or able to form opinions or able to apply our knowledge on all aspects of the idea. And we are able to tell what is important, what is not important. We are able to prioritize. All this comes under evaluation. Now the last would be creation. Creation means a student is able to do something out of his knowledge. He is able to bring out the different parts of knowledge, and he is able to build something new and build up new relationships or develop into new situations. He may suggest some alternatives, and he may also give out certain reasons. And this cognitive process is the highest level. And here the student is able to synthesize as well as create. And here there is an increasing complexity of the thinking skills. And right from the early stages of remembering or understanding, now he has come to a stage where he is able to master the knowledge as well as the skills. And he is now able to create something new. So if we were to see the process dimension and process of revised Bloom's taxonomy, there are several processes associated. For example, for remember, what is the processes that are involved? Recognizing and recalling. Recognizing would mean it would have sub-processes like identifying, retrieving. Whereas recalling major process would have sub-processes as clarification as well as paraphrasing. If we were to understand interpreting, the many major processes seen under understanding are interpreting. Interpreting would have sub-processes like representing and translating and illustrating. The second would be exemplifying, that is giving examples. Now, the sub-process would be trying to talk about instances specifically. The other sub-process would be, under understanding, would be classifying. Now, this classification process may have sub-processes like categorizing, and whereas summarizing would have sub-processes like abstracting, generalizing, concluding, extrapolating, etc. And inferring, summarizing, these are all the other processes. Summarizing would mean actually trying to generalize, and inferring means trying to extrapolate. Comparing is other sub-process, which will have sub-processes like contrasting, mapping, matching, etc. Explaining would mean constructing models. Application would have processes like executing and implementing. That would have sub-processes like carrying out and using. Analysis would have processes like differentiating, organizing, attributing, which would have sub-processes like discriminating, distinguishing, focusing, selecting, finding coherence, integrating, etc. Now, evaluation would mean checking something, that is understanding what is wrong or right about a thing, as well as critiquing. Critiquing means making a comment on something, that is judging. Creating may have the processes like generating, planning, and producing. That is, you may hypothesize something, planning means you may design something, and produce means to construct something. Now, most of the question papers in the classroom or evaluation would be based on these objectives. For example, some questions that the teacher may ask may be dependent only on the subject matter, or memory, that is like remembering, recall, or what is an example, classify so and so, summarize something, and compare the contrast between two things, etc., or explain a particular process. These are the lower level thinking skills. But application, applying the knowledge to a new situation, a novel situation, or asking them to differentiate between two things, as well as try to check or make a comment or judge something or make a critique, that would come under the higher level order thinkings. But creating a new model or planning something or trying to design something, predicting something would come under the higher level thinking skills. Now, according to the Bloom's taxonomy, we have to evaluate what we teach. So if we were to teach in a classroom, we have to see that certain learning objectives are attained in the classroom. Therefore, we talk about learning outcomes, learning processes. The process should have certain learning outcomes. So the learning outcomes, what we see, are given in terms of learning objectives. And most of these learning objectives are actually spelled out by the teacher in the terms of the lesson plan. A teacher generally writes a lesson plan, and most of these lesson plans have these processes incorporated, and these are adjectives actually, like recognizing, recalling, interpreting, giving examples, etc. But these are all belong to different levels of thinking, and we talk about the remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and creating dimensions in the knowledge aspect. We are not going in detail about the affective and psychomotor domains. They also have their own way of actually being categorized or being given into adjective forms. But here the focus is more on the cognitive domain processes in the classroom. And all the learning objectives can be actually thought of as the learning objectives, and it is these learning objectives that a teacher thinks about when she enters a classroom, or then she tries to give an exam. It is these questions that are framed in terms of the learning objectives. That is, the learning objectives are questioned, they are given in the form of exam, and when a teacher understands how much she is able to teach the children, or how much the children are able to learn in a classroom, he or she is able to understand because of the answers they get. They're evaluated, and the teacher is able to understand what learning the child was able to get because of her teaching. Now, these are known as the learning outcomes. So the learning objectives help in knowing the learning outcomes of the children in the classroom. Now we have to frame the objectives in such a way in the classroom, that is, we have to see that the children are both able to gain knowledge, they're able to remember, and also they have to have the higher processes in the classroom. That is, they should be able to also understand or analyze or apply the knowledge to the better situation. So the teacher should be able to see that all these are there in the classroom, that both the lower order thinking skills as well as higher order thinking skills are there in the classroom. A teacher also has to teach in such a way that he or she is gradually able to go from the lower order skills to the higher order skills. I think I have been clear enough about the Bloom's taxonomy. We would now go on to the types of learning. There are several types of learning. We have about the verbal learning taking in the classroom, also about the social learning in the classroom, that is learning which occurs in the social settings. We also have got the constructivist thoughts of learning, that is learning occurs in such a way so that the behavior of the children can be transformed, the knowledge can be transformed, and also learning helps in the social development. Now these are come under the different aspects of the learning. For example, the social constructivism talks about in making the child able to deal with social situations, whereas the behaviorist theory talks about, the behavior psychologists talk about how we can change the behavior of the child through education. Also, the cognitive psychologist talks about how learning occurs in the children. Now, these are the different ways through which the learning occurs in the child. Generally, we also talk about the verbal learning. The verbal learning occurs because of a processes, different methods are popular actually about the verbal learning. We talk about the paired associative learning. That is, you may have several set of nonsense syllables as well as meaningful words. So the paired associative words help you to understand the meaningful words after presence of the nonsense syllable. So the total number of trails that one is able to recollect all the meaningful words is known as the paired associative learning. So we try to associate certain things with certain other things, and this is how we are able to learn. This is one aspect of learning. The other method involved is serial learning. That is, if we try to recall a process in a serial manner and with which one word is linked with the other, that is known as the serial learning. Sometimes we talk about the free recall. The free recall is if we try to recall in our spare time, try to think whatever we have learned during a particular phase of learning, we are able to learn certain things. That is, if we are supposed presented with about 20 words and we are able to connect those words and are able to remember them later, and we are able to, if we are actually trying to form some association, it is paired associative learning. Or if we try to learn them in series, it is serial learning. But if we try to recall them freely, that is known as free learning. All these come under the process of verbal learning or trying to learn about the words. Now, there is also something like social learning. Social learning is dependent on what we learn in the environment and how we gain insights and how we gain experiences through observation or trying to incorporate all these behaviors from the people around us into our own learning or into our own experiences. Now, when we learn social learning, we send the children to the school so that they are able to learn from their peers by observing them. So that is how during COVID situations, we found that the children were suffering from a lack of social learning and they're not able to have the social skills. Now, this is because learning also occurs by seeing the others and learning from the others' behaviors. Now, if we were to see the steps in social learning, we know that attention is one of the aspects that is seen in the classroom. We know that the attention helps to actually, it's a very complex process, attention. And now attention is not focused for much time. We know that in the children. And here, the attention would mean that there should be reinforcement and all the sensory capacities have to be fully focused. And then only attention occurs. So in a setting in a classroom in the social learning, we see that the attention of the child or the span of attention of the child is more than when the child learns by himself. Also, retention is more when the child learns in a social setting. Reproduction or the ability to produce the same knowledge also is more in a social setting. And also child is motivated when he learns along with his or her peers. Now, this would make it ideal for social learning. So learning also occurs, learning of behaviors occurs in a social settings. Now, there is a person known as Vygotsky, a Russian psychologist. He said that in a social context, the interactions are necessary, and learning does not mean simply assimilation and accommodation. It is also a process by which a knowledge is integrated through social interactions. Vygotsky says that language and culture develop in the individual, that is cognitive development occurs in social settings. He talks about collaborative process between the learner and the teacher. And it is the help of the teacher, the help of the peers, or with the help of the elders that our knowledge goes on increasing. And it is the guidance of the teacher or the collaborative effort or the group learning where peer-peer interaction is there that knowledge is gained. We know that according to the behavioristic psychologist, all the motivation is extrinsic, or motivation should be given from outside. So when a person is motivated, he is able to do well. But in cognitive reinforcement, what happens? It is the motivation which is intrinsic. That is, the child by himself should be able to develop motivation. It is not because of external reinforcement or external praise or external criticism that the child is able to develop. So behavior psychologists talk about extrinsic motivation, whereas cognitive psychologists talk about intrinsic motivation, or the motivation to achieve something comes from inside the person. But in social constructivist theory, that is by which the constructivism, that is the social settings actually help the child to develop in a constructive manner. In such theories, motivation is both extrinsic as well as intrinsic. Now, Vygotsky talks about the zone of proximal development. For example, there may be a phase, say at the age of 13 years, where motivation or external support or knowledge imbibement is to be given at a particular stage. And here, at this stage, the child requires the maximum help. And if some child were to receive some help, that is motivation as well as knowledge, appropriate way of learning, communicating, at this zone, say at the age of around 13 years, they are able to do well. If the child is not able to receive certain, what we call motivation as well as knowledge, or the ability to think at certain stage, then the child would suffer. So if we compare the two children, one who receives the motivational support as well as knowledge at some age and who does not receive, we find that there is a zone, particular stage where such a help would help in the active development of the child. So we call this as the zone of proximal development, or the level of potential development. That is, it indicates the level of development that the learner is capable of reaching. So here, the teachers or what we call the individuals who are your relatives, maybe your friends, or who are at a higher knowledge phase, that they are able to give you support, and therefore an individual is able to learn because of such interactions. So this is how motivation can help actually the child in their development. And with this here, we'd like to stop about learning. Let us continue with the aspects of learning and transfer of learning tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.